There we go.
All right. Hi, everyone. We're just going to wait a few minutes till we see this participant number go up.
There we go. Looks like people are coming in.
Hey, everyone. We're just waiting for the participant's number to level out a little bit. And we can get started. All right, looks like it's stopped for now. So I'm Dana Hunter. I'm with the Scranton Area Foundation. I know you guys usually see Maggie's face, but she had something else come up, so you get to see me. I am from the Scranton Area Foundation, and as you know, we have an arm, the Center for Community Leadership and Nonprofit Excellence, and we have that in order to help you guys grow in your organizations and your mission. This is the fourth in our series, and we are joined by GrantsPlus, and we're so excited about that. And just a little bit about the Scranton Area Foundation. I'm sure you all know that we are a community foundation, and we started in 1954, and we work with many organizations in the community, as well as hold funds for people that are interested in growing their philanthropic reach. So that's a little bit about us. We are recording this, and there will be an email sent later with the information. So if you miss anything, you can go back and see. There's a little bit about the Center for Community Leadership and Nonprofit Excellence. It was started in 2012, and it's to help with the capacity building needs of the nonprofit organizations in our community. We're very proud of what we do, and I feel like we've done a pretty good job of touching on a lot of different aspects of helping the nonprofit organization. So we'd like to continue that in the future. And we have Matt Carter and Kara Elsila joining us today to do this webinar.
Great, thank you, and thanks for jumping on and making sure we had a host today. Appreciate that. So like Dana said, I am Matt Carter from GrantsPlus. I'm one of our senior advisors. I'm joined by my colleague, Kari Elsila. I'll let her introduce herself in a moment. I'm actually our senior advisor for training. So I do a lot of training on grant seeking, and I'm always excited to be able to do this with organizations and with people. And Kari actually is in charge of our writing practice, so is the absolute perfect person to have talked to you about storytelling, because it is one of the things that she makes sure that we all do in all of our work when we're working with clients. So Kari, do you want to introduce yourself really quickly, and then we'll jump in?
Yeah, thank you. Not much to add to that, but hi everyone. As Matt said, my name is Kari Elsila. I'm a senior advisor here at GrantsPlus. I'm based in Cleveland, Ohio, but like Matt, work with clients across the country to help improve their strategic grant seeking. So we assist with things like identifying potential funders, developing strategies to approach those funders, helping with the grant writing. So anything having to do with helping organizations increase their success with grants. And as Matt said, I do have a particular focus on supporting excellence in writing at GrantsPlus. So I help out with professional development and internal writing support and feedback to make sure our staff of grant writers is always working toward excellence. So we do talk a lot internally among our team about storytelling and how it can help bring proposals to life. So I'm excited to be here today to talk about that topic with you all.
Great, thank you. So a couple things about our partnership. So this is the fourth in our series of 6 webinars. So we're doing webinars every Tuesday, every other Tuesday through mid-December. So we've got 2 more. I'm excited about that. And we're also doing coaching sessions, which you'll in the email you get afterwards, you'll get how to sign up for that. It's the same page where you signed up for this, just a little bit farther down. But our coaching sessions are great because you get to talk to one of our senior staff members about essentially any problem that is vexing you. We have talked about, we've helped some of your colleagues find funders. We've talked about how to get their board involved, and actually how to deal with a board that doesn't necessarily want to be involved. We've talked about approaching a couple funders. We've talked about how do you actually call and talk to a funder about your new program and kind of narrow down whether you're a fit or not, so you can save hours of writing with minutes of talking. So just a whole bunch of great stuff, and we've gotten introduced to a lot of great organizations in your area that way, and it's been really fun to do. I'm one of the people who does a lot of them. Kari does a couple as well. And if you have anything you've ever wanted to ask about grant seeking but are afraid to ask, come ask us, because we've probably heard it before. And if we haven't heard it before, we'll probably be really intrigued and work to find an answer for you. So signups for that will come. That, like I said, there'll be an email with a link to the recording and signups for that. So please do that if you're interested. Also, like I said, our 2 upcoming webinars. So in 2 weeks, we are doing preparing your team to pursue federal grants. And that's not necessarily, it's based on federal grants, but it's also just for large grants in general. So it's going to be talking about grant making as a team sport, which is one of my favorite things to talk about, both in trainings and with clients, because I know a lot of development staff are overworked, and or a lot of executive directors are the training staff, so or the development staff. So that's a great one, and I hope to see you all there. And then our final one will be December 14th, and that is going to be about what local based organizations can do to attract national funders. And that's going to be really interesting. I'm actually putting that one together right now with a couple of my colleagues, and it's going to be great. So I hope to see all of you at both of those. I mentioned the coaching sessions. This is just what it looks like to sign up on our site. We've got some great feedback from people. And the sign up for those are for this month is going to close this Friday. So if you want one this month, please sign up. Please don't sign up for Thanksgiving, because it won't let you, I hope. And then for December sessions, if you want to have one in December, the sign up for that closes December 3rd. So get over there and sign up. So having said all that as our preface, let's talk about what we are going to discuss today. We are going to talk about why stories matter. So why are we here to talk about this? We're going to talk about what makes a good story that are going to grab funders and make them pay attention. We're going to talk about how to collect and develop stories within your organization and make it a practice. And we're going to talk about how to use stories in your grants. And then the bold ends and your other fundraising work, because everything we're going to talk about works in all of your fundraising. We're just GrantsPlus. We deal in grants. That's the water we swim in. So that's what we're going to focus on. But most of what we're going to talk about today is also applicable to just about everything else you do, from your elevator story to talking to somebody at a party to writing a giant federal grant. So let's start right in with why stories matter. And before we do that, I just want to launch a quick poll. You guys should be able to see this now. We'll give you about 30 seconds. Just about kind of where you are in using stories right now, you personally or your organization. Got a couple votes in here. So far, we have no votes for we never use stories. This is great. I realize I've just tilted the poll because if one of you was going to press we never use stories. You can be brave and do that. It's okay. Nobody knows who voted for what. Okay, everybody is here. So I'm going to end this and share some results. I already gave away our trick question of we never use stories. Nobody chose that. So it looks like we've got a good distribution between occasionally, often, and every single time, which is great. I am hoping that we can move the occasionallys up to often, and that we can move the often up to every time, because stories are really important. And in grant seeking, they are what makes your grant stand out. There's a lot of boring grant writing out there, and that's not necessarily the fault of the grant writers. There's a lot of boring applications out there. So being able to set yourself apart with a story makes a huge difference. So I should also mention too, by the way, if you have questions throughout, we'll have a Q&A time at the end, but you'll see there's a little Q&A, 2 little chat bubbles in your controls for Zoom. If you want to ask us a question at any point, please use that instead of chat, mostly because it's easier for us to keep track of. So having said all that, why stories matter. And first things first, we have to give data its due. So grant funders especially do expect solid data. They want to be able to make a rational decision based on what you present to them of whether they should fund you or not. And the plural of story is not data. Just because you've got a bunch of great stories doesn't mean you've got hard data. So you still need to have that. You still need to show who you serve, what outcomes you're having, what you're doing to that population, how many people you're impacting, how you know that you're being successful, all of that. None of this replaces data, but all of this adds to data, because there is this neat quirk of the human mind. Our compassion and desire to help people diminishes as we talk about more people. So it's this weird thing. If you talk about one person, if you tell one person's story, that grabs the heart and causes action. If you talk about the same thing happening to 10,000 people, it just becomes this thing that people cannot comprehend. And it does not inspire compassion. It makes no sense. The human mind would rather help one specific person than 100 non-specific people. It is a weird thing, but it's how we're wired. Some of you may have seen this quote. It's often attributed to Stalin, which feels a little weird to use in a presentation, but it's just a great quote. And that is, the death of one man is a catastrophe. 100,000 dead, that's a statistic. So that's what we're talking about here. Data has no heart. And in the human mind, once a number becomes a number, it stops being a human being. So we are here today to talk about how do we make sure that human beings are front and center in everything that you're talking about when you're doing your fundraising. So the reality is that while grant makers are asking for data, they don't usually ask for stories. We know that they still need the story to get into what you're doing, to feed their heart, to grab them as human beings and help them understand the change that you're making in the world. A grant maker is not a person generally, it's an institution, but they're still made up of people, and those people make the choices. So a good story that talks about what you do and really illustrates the change that you make in the world can make a huge difference in your grant, as far as keeping a funder interested, helping a funder understand what you do, and in the end, helping you raise money to advance your mission. So with that as our preface, I'm going to pass this over to Kari to talk about the elements of a good story.
Great, thanks, Matt. So yeah, now that we've discussed the importance of using stories in conveying the work of your organizations, let's dive into what makes a story strong. And here's some elements that make those stories really pop out. So elements of a good story include being simple, credible, surprising or unexpected, relatable, and emotionally impactful. And we're going to be going through each of these today to explain what we mean by them and to give some real examples. Now, these concepts were inspired by a book called Made to Stick. I think Matt's pointing to it on his bookshelf there, by Chip and Dan Heath, two brothers, Chip and Dan Heath, Heath. And we've adopted their concepts for grant writing in particular, but we recommend that book for anyone wanting to dig into this topic a little more. Their premise is that there's certain traits that can make an idea or a message sticky and memorable in someone's brain. So the first concept we're going to talk about is simple. Okay, in storytelling and in grant writing alike, simple is important because it lets you quickly demonstrate your core idea, which you'll come back to throughout your proposal. It lets you be focused, and it lets you convey why the person you're writing about and your organization intersected. So it's important that you're not just sharing a story about a person in isolation and not just a story about your organization, but the story you focus on is really about a person and your organization and what happened when they came together. So to get started, when you're thinking about a simple story, really focus in on the story you want to tell, on the core of your idea or your thought. Think about what it is you're truly trying to convey with your story, and find a message or a story that's easy to remember and easy to read. You don't want that grant reader or reviewer getting lost or confused or giving up. You want a nice, simple story that really gets to the heart of what you're trying to convey. So for each of these traits, we're going to give examples from real clients that GrantsPlus worked with. So we think it really helpful to share kind of a not simple example and then a simple example. for the same story. So the not simple version of this story would be Mary, along with her children, came to our shelter, which serves those escaping domestic violence, whether from parents, spouses, or others. Like so many of those we serve, they arrived with little but the clothes that they were wearing because Mary had picked the children up at school like she always does, but came to the shelter instead of bringing the children back home. Now, if we were to rewrite that in a simple version, it would look something like this. Mary and her children came to our shelter with only the clothes on their backs and looking over their shoulders for Mary's husband, who had been physically and emotionally abusing them for years. Now, you'll see that when you go with the simple approach, you really boil the story down to a memorable core idea. And that idea is that Mary felt unsafe and she took action to leave. Now, you'll note that the story also shows that she needed assistance because she left the situation with very few tangible items. And this is where you start to see the person and the organization intersecting, like we were talking about. But again, with a simple story like this, it's brief, it's clear, it's vivid, and it takes you right into the heart of the situation. The second attribute when we talk about qualities of an effective story is that stories need to be believable and credible. Just like the quantitative data Matt was mentioning, you want to have stories that really have that ring of truth. Now, luckily, when you're using client stories, they typically feel credible inherently because they're based on someone's real life experience. So they do have that truth baked into them. But the thing about a credible story is you still want it to be clear and direct and to the point, but it has to have enough detail to really create that credibility in the reader's mind. One thing to note is that you can use a composite story if necessary, especially if your organization doesn't have a history or a practice of using or collecting client stories yet. You can craft a story that's based on multiple people's experiences or generalize if necessary, but it still needs to be credible. So let's get into some examples of what that looks like. In the less credible version of this story we're sharing, it might look something like this. Derek and his 3 young children have been living in their car and in shelters for most of the children's lives and rarely sit down to a meal as a family. Our shelter provided one of their first family dinners ever. The more credible version of that reads, dinner was always a time for family bonding in Derek's life, and one of the things that bothered him most about being homeless was that he never got a chance to eat meals with his children. Talking to his case manager a few days into his stay with us, he teared up talking about last night's dinner. When asked what was wrong, he said that after they ate, he had to explain to his kids what leftovers were because they had never been in a stable living situation that allowed for something as simple as wrapping up food to reheat the next day. And this is a real story from when Matt worked at a homeless shelter, I think probably 10, 12 years ago now, but he still remembers it vividly. And you can see what makes this story credible and believable is that there's enough details to make the reader feel that Derek is real and his situation is authentic. The first example, even though it's briefer, it's a little less credible. It feels a little more generic and general. It doesn't have those supporting details. Again, you'll see that the story brings in the organization and the difference that it's making in Derek's life. And we'll keep talking about this throughout, but how storytelling can really illustrate the arc of a client's journey. So when you're thinking about stories, a good way to frame them is to focus on a client's situation before they came to your organization, what happened when they encountered your organization and the difference that made, and then what that person's life is like afterwards. So here you can kind of see that middle section, the transformational services that the organization is providing, but you're also getting the sense that Derek's trajectory might be changing because of his encounter with the organization. So that is, again, about being credible. And please continue to drop in any comments, questions in the Q&A if you have examples you want to share or questions about these concepts, please. We'll be monitoring that throughout. The next concept is, and I did want to say that you might not, have the opportunity, or it might not be realistic to incorporate all of these traits in a single story, but we're trying to give you a toolkit of different ways you can go. This one I think is a little more tricky or advanced, but it's a good one to share. What's nice about this one is, again, it'll for the grant reviewer and the grant reader, they're not going to be reading the same old thing. There's a surprising twist that will really help them remember the story and your organization. So as an example, in the Made to Stick book that we were mentioning about, it talks about a public service announcement on television that looks just like another minivan ad with a happy family driving down the street. You don't quite know what's up. And then a big truck rams into them, and you find out that it's a spot to remind you to always wear your seatbelt because you never know when a crash will happen. So that is kind of a vivid example of when something unexpected happens and it really does stick in your mind. So in a proposal, it might look something like this. The not unexpected version of a story would be, every day Jonathan gets dressed in his uniform, clocks into his job on time, and puts in an 8-hour day. Unfortunately, that's not enough for him to reliably put food on his family's table. Now, I will point out that that example is simple and credible. It's just not unexpected. So the unexpected twist would look something like this. Every day, Jonathan gets dressed in his uniform, clocks into his job on time, and puts in an 8-hour day. Unfortunately, that's not enough for him to reliably put food on his family's table and leaves him little time to study. Jonathan is a high school junior, doing what he can to make sure his mom and little brothers can stay in their apartment, but the struggle between earning the money they need and staying in school is becoming untenable for him. So the second example really surprises you as the reader once you find out that this is a teenager we're talking about. And because it's that unexpected twist, it's more likely to stick in your head. The next attribute of an effective story is that it's relatable. The story you select should be relatable to a majority of people. And there's a couple of reasons for that. The more relatable a story is, the more people can see themselves in it. They can kind of fill in the blanks of the story and see themselves in that situation or a loved one in that situation. And the more they see themselves in that story, the more they'll remember and the more impact it'll have. Now, I'll say that, a client you're writing about and a funder or donor who's going to be reading this proposal might not ostensibly have a lot in common on paper, like the high school junior in the previous example. Maybe the grant reviewer's never been in a situation like that and can't relate on a exact one-to-one level. But there is a shared humanity and shared experiences that we can all appeal to and think about where that commonality is. So, we're all someone's children. Many of us are parents. Many of us can relate to having been in certain situations. So it's about kind of teasing out where is that common ground and that relatability. And so here's some examples of that. In this less relatable version, the text would read, thanks to decades of hyperinflation, Jaya worries that she will not be able to pay her children's school fees, which are now more than 10,000 Zimbabwean dollars per year. So, that's a little less relatable. You likely don't know how much a Zimbabwean dollar is worth, or you might not even be able to find Zimbabwe on a map. So it might be a little hard to relate. So we would suggest rewriting it in this way. Like any parent, Jaya dreams of a better life for her children. Unfortunately, her salary does not stretch as far as it used to, and she's in danger of not being able to pay her children's school tuition. Jaya is having trouble sleeping most nights because she knows that without an education, her children will face dim prospects in the job market. You can see in that second version, instead of focusing on the fact that the client is from Zimbabwe, which might make the story initially unrelatable, the example focuses on the commonality of parenting and of wanting the best for your children, of trying to stretch your salary, all those things. Now, of course, this proposal would go on and address the fact that Jay is from Zimbabwe, because clearly this organization does work there and hopefully has identified a funder who's interested in funding abroad. But the story begins by stressing the relatability. And finally, the last concept we wanted to highlight in terms of an effective story is stories that are emotionally impactful. The best stories have an emotional impact that go after the heart as well as the mind. Typically we think of appealing to the heart through that qualitative information, and the mind with that quantitative data that mentioned earlier. But emotion really helps people see the importance of an idea and moves them on a human level. One technique that we try to use at GrantsPlus in our grant writing to help build emotionally impactful stories is to let the client or the subject tell their own story in their own words. So that could be things like using direct quotes or first person voice to give the person agency and put them front and center in the story. And so here's an example of that. The less emotionally impactful version would be, ever since her mom's hours and salary were cut, Nevaeh hasn't been able to attend ballet classes. And the more impactful version would be this direct quote, first person story written like this. One of the worst parts about taking a pay cut at work was having to tell my daughter, Nevaeh, that we couldn't afford the ballet lessons that she's taken since she was 2. I felt like the worst mom in the world. Watching her come home from school and move the furniture to practice her technique on her own only made the pain grow. She never complained, but it tore me up that she lost such a huge part of her identity. And you can see, there's that relatability of person to person, parent to parent, and that change to that first person telling really hits you emotionally. And then, as we've been talking about, this story would continue. This is kind of the before part of that arc, the client's journey, the client's arc, before the client and the organization intersected. And I can tell you, these are all real stories. And this is a real story about a city ballet that was a former client of ours. And they offer full scholarships to talented students from low income families. So the story does have a happy ending, and you would see more of that arc, and that intersection and the change in trajectory in a full grant proposal. So I think, one of the things we wanted to talk about in this section is about ethical storytelling. So when we use client stories, we want to make sure we're doing it in a respectful, ethical way. Stories definitely add to the vibrancy of a proposal, and they're important in conveying the organization's work, and we recommend using them, which is why we're here today to talk about it. But we never want to exploit the people that we're writing about. And so that means several things, right? We want to make sure we have the consent of the people we write about. So as you're collecting stories from clients, you want to make sure that they are full participants in telling their story, and that they have signed off in all the ways that you might use their information. We want to make sure that we don't victimize a client. It's not just about that they're having hard times, and you're not going to describe that out of context, but you want to focus on also the larger systems or larger constructs that brought them to this place. And for those of you who attended our earlier webinar on language, that'll be a familiar concept. We talked about focusing on systems and not just symptoms. So not just that someone is having a rough time, but talking about the larger societal constructs that brought them to that point. We want to make sure we highlight their dignity and let them be front and center in their story. And that's another good reason for using first person voice, really letting them tell their story. And we want to make sure that we're not just exploiting them for that emotional reaction solely, right? Emotional reaction is important. It's a good hook, but we're not just using their story as a way for people to feel pity or to gawk at them. We're using these stories because they're representative of a larger circumstance. And that's where, we can marry the emotional stories with the quantitative data, right? This is someone's circumstance, but they're not in this alone. This person is helping tell, point out the need and the situation that exists for many more people. This person isn't an anomaly. But what we are doing is using their story to put a face to a common condition that needs solving. And that's the work of your organization, to solve that issue. So those are kind of the elements of strong stories that we wanted to share. I know Matt dropped the name of the book in the chat as well, if you're interested in seeing other examples of those concepts. But I'm going to pass it back over to Matt at this point to talk about collecting stories and how you can build a practice at your organization of having these stories kind of queued up and ready to go. And I see Matt also did just drop a link into the chat about ethical storytelling, which kind of reinforces that last slide I was talking about. And there's actually even this is a new endeavor, but there's a pledge on there you can take as an organization that you pledge yourself to ethical storytelling. So there's some really good information out there on that topic.
Great. And Kari, before I get into talking about, how to sort of operationalize this in your work, one of the things that I noticed while you were talking that I didn't notice when we were collecting stories to put this together is that almost every example we gave talks about family. And that goes back to that sort of universal thing. Every single one of us is part of some kind of family, for good or bad as we approach the family holidays. But a lot of that just sort of speaks to what we were talking about here, of that universality of being able to see yourself in whatever story you're telling. So even when it's surprising, something unexpected happens, you can still sort of see yourself. So all of these concepts work together to reinforce one another. I bet if we had a challenge, you could probably come up with a story that hits every single one of them. That might be a little bit ridiculous, but it just sort of flows throughout. So with that, let's talk about how to operationalize this. And again, both the polls fall to me today. So I'm going to launch another poll for us to see if everyone is paying attention here. And this is just about, for those of you that do use stories in your communications, how do you go about collecting them now? And by the way, from the last poll, we know that all of you use at least some stories in what you do. So everybody's on the hook to answer this one. I've got a few answered, a little more variety this time. And give this about 10 more seconds. Should hum the Jeopardy theme while we do this. All right, 4 more seconds. All right. So, interesting spread on this one. Everybody's using stories, but only a few of you have a regular process on this. I love it. Asking the people that you serve is obviously the best way to get this, but I'm hoping we can have most of you move to this regularly asking people category. So let's talk about how we operationalize this. And again, this is all stuff that we've worked with clients or have seen within our own careers. This is not, nice stuff that maybe happens if you're the perfect nonprofit. This is real, real things that we've seen. So the first thing on that is to make sure that everyone understands that stories are vitally important to what you do. They're vitally important to communicating what you do to the public, so you have public support. They're vitally important to communicating what you do to those who fund you, so you have funding to carry out your mission. And they're really just important to making sure that everyone understands what you do. People will pass along a story that they've heard about something interesting. They're not going to pass along some nice stats or a nice graph from your annual report. So this is important. This isn't just something that once a year you're like, hey, we need to update a couple of stories on our website and our annual report. Can anybody think of anything? This really needs to be operationalized into what you do, because it is going to help you be more successful. So the first thing about this then is, how do we get these stories? Well, we ask. So even when you've got a great system in place, you've still got to ask your clients for their stories. And this is not just, hey, we need stories from you. Can you please help us? This actually helps you show the people that you serve that you do care. And if you can let them share outside the boundaries of your work. So if you're a human service organization and they're there for a session, maybe don't ask them there. Maybe ask them outside of that. Approach them as a human being. Approach them as someone who is going to them almost peer to peer. Don't let this feel like you're ticking something off a box. I think the slide is good stories don't come from asking a list of questions. You don't get good stories out of a survey. People will just click off what they want and move on. This is a conversation. And the nice part about this is that doing this regularly can be self-care, and not for your clients. It can be self-care for you. You can help see the difference that you're making. You can reconnect emotionally to your work. You can see that the people coming in and out of your programming are not just numbers. They're real human beings, and you're having a real impact. So making this part of what you do every day, it takes a little bit of practice to do, and you have to remember, because we're all doing 400 other things. But in the end, it is so worth it. It helps you make these genuine connections with your clients. It helps you remember why you're doing what you do. It really is just a great way to add that human level to your work every day. The one caveat on that we're going to do twice, because Kari already talked about this, is make sure that clients know that you are not doing this to parade their misery, and make sure that your clients know that sharing is 100% optional. That if they don't want to share their story, that is fine. You understand, move on. This should never be a requirement of getting any kind of a service or anything like that. So that said, it is all upside and almost no downside here. So one of the things that we work with clients is actually building a library on this. And that serves a couple of purposes. So you basically are looking to develop ready to use stories that have been through whatever vetting process you've got, that I know as a grant writer, or your program director knows in her work, or whoever knows that you've got this collection of stories about what you do out there, and that they are ready to go. And there's really no great way to do this. I mean, whatever works for you, do. I know there's some organizations that just have a testimonial section on their website, and they will plop 40 stories on there. One of my favorite ones is an organization that actually uses one of those usually annoying rotating slide things on their site, and they have a ton of stories. And every time you hit reload, or every time you go there, there's something new in there. So it can be something that simple. It could be more complicated. It could be your communications person has a fairly complicated library. It could be a binder with paper if we're in person. There's whatever works for you, do it, just so that everyone knows that this is where our stories live, and once they're here, they are approved to use. Ideally, you're going to have enough of a collection of stories that you're not using the same 3 over and over in every single communication. But I would say even that is better than using no stories. The other thing to do is make sure that you're sharing these internally. So you as executive director, you as development person might know that these stories exist, and you might know all the great stories, but if other people in your organization don't, that does you no good. So again, they can help people feel more connected to your work, sharing them with your board, sharing them with your staff, starting a staff meeting with something really interesting that happened, whatever that is. They will help people feel more connected to your work, even if they're right in the middle of it, because odds are the busiest person in your organization that you think knows everything is probably only seeing some slice of what you're doing. So it's always great to include those. And really, the more organic ways you can do that, the better. Talk with board members about them, talk with volunteers about them. Don't put your couple best stories on a sheet and hand it out and say, okay, read this. You want, the whole point of the stories is to have that human connection. So you want to keep doing that. So having said all that, let's talk about how we put stories to work in actually bringing in more money for what you do, because ultimately that's what we as GrantsPlus and the foundation are here for, is funding your work. So first things first, like I said, stories are for sharing. If nobody is hearing your stories, it doesn't matter that you have 100 perfectly curated stories that are super great if they're just sitting there. So we're talking about grant seeking, obviously that's what we do, but use them wherever you can. We see a lot of events where somebody will come and tell their story. So somebody in the organization to help will come and tell their story. Those are great. but even being able to tell a client story there, making it part of your elevator pitch. We're going to talk in a minute about grabbing your reader's attention. And that can also be grabbing someone's attention that you're talking to. Making sure that you've got some human element and a human story in your elevator pitch. And obviously fundraising. So let's talk about using this in fundraising specifically. There's two real main ways to do this. And the first one is grabbing your reader's attention. So when you're writing a grant proposal, you all have seen the form, most of you have seen the forms anyway, if not all of you, where you start with, tell us about your organization's history and mission and all of that. And any place where you can go and inject a relatable story that talks about why your program is important right off the bat is going to grab the reader, because yours is probably one in a stack of, 10 to 100 grant proposals, and you want to stand out. So there's some great ways to do this. We talked about, having that surprising twist. This can be the example that we used about, the junior in high school having to work to feed his family would be a great way to start out with the need. And then you roll into, like blah, blah, blah. We serve 300 kids like this every day. Whatever that is, that you can connect the story to the broader need. So yes, this is the person we're serving, but there is a huge need out there, whatever that is. And then connecting it into your work, like we talked about in the examples of, and this is what we do to solve this issue. So let's talk about a real world example. And this is a couple slides. I'm going to read it like a nice narrator. But this is actually from a client of ours, from a higher ed client. We were working on a program to help parent students. So every morning, Monique's alarm rouses her at 6 a.m. with its shrill beep. In the hour before her 3 kids wake up, she finishes any homework assignment from the full load of classes she's taking at our college and gets ready for her busy day. So right away, this is not the typical student experience. This is not, hey, I've got an early lab, I've got to get down to class. This is, I have to get my kids ready for school and then, get ready for my own school. On her schedule, working a 4-hour shift at her job and attending her anatomy and physiology class at our college, a required course for the nursing degree she's pursuing. As a single parent, Monique will also shepherd her children through the day, getting them to and from school, supervising their homework, preparing their dinner, and spending quality time with them before tucking them in at night. So right away, we're talking about a student who is dealing with a whole bunch of other stuff on top of also trying to get a nursing degree. I'm already interested. This is not just a boring proposal about student services. On good days, everything works well. On more challenging days, like those with a sick child, a car problem, or an issue that keeps her late at her job, Monique struggles to make it all work. So this is her story. Then we move into the connection to the college and the broader need. There are a growing number of women like Monique, single student parents who are juggling their college dreams with the demands of children. More than 25% of the students at our college are single student parents. Hundreds of our students face challenges like Monique, and our College Parent Resource Center helps them overcome these challenges by offering specialized academic counseling, access to wraparound services, and then we get into all of the great stuff that goes on and all the things that can be made possible by grant funding. But right off the bat, we've used a couple paragraphs of space, and we're telling you Monique's story, not the story of the Parent Resource Center. So odds are you are far more interested already than if we just started off the bat with the Parent Resource Center helps hundreds of students at our college who are also parents and facing struggles. That's neat, that's factual, but this makes this human. So that's the number one way. If this is the only story you use in a grant proposal, you've already set this up with a real human being and have grabbed attention. But one of the other ways to make this work is being able to talk about a client's journey through what you do. So this is talking about the great work that your organization does through the lens of a single person moving through it. Again, could be a composite person, but talking about the journey. What was their life like before they came to you? Why did they seek out your services? What services did they use? How did they use them? And what change did you create? So what lasting change have you made in their life? And this is usually a composite person when we're using these in reality, because it's very, very seldom does one person go through the ideal of everything. But if you can use one person, that's fantastic. So again, let's talk about how we use that. So step one in this is showing the need. So 5-year-old Grant is having a tough time at school. Although he's just a kindergartner, he's been acting so aggressively in class that his teacher is afraid he might hurt another student. One day after being sent to the office, he began flipping over chairs and pulling things off the wall. Clearly, he was in need of support. So there's our problem. We have Grant, he's having some problems. Fortunately, our organization was there to leap into action. Our school-based services program embeds mental health staff at our schools throughout the city and provides crucial services to children and families. Now, again, had they just put in that second paragraph, that would have been interesting. I would have kind of known, okay, well, clearly there's some needs because they're in schools. But instead, I have our friend Grant, our little friend who is 5 years old and is freaking out at school because of something. And now I know, okay, that is not a good situation. And I know this organization is here to help. So this sets up that need. So let's talk about what the organization does. So in Grant's case, our school coordinator, the first point of contact for school-based services, quickly became involved. Chelsea, already on site at the school and trusted by school staff, was invited to come to the office and work with Grant. First, she knelt to speak to Grant on his level. At first, he tried picking up things to throw, but Chelsea calmly removed each one from his small hand and asked him to breathe deeply with her. Chelsea then began a discussion with Grant, steering him towards a more productive way of communicating. Chelsea has continued to work hand in hand with school staff to improve Grant's situation. They reassessed his daily schedule and approached his education more holistically. So this is how the organization, this is how Grant is working through the organization. We've got that first point where the coordinator, Chelsea, comes in basically as the cavalry, rides it and helps him. And there is some detail in there about, making this credible, making this real. This is a real story because we've got the detail of she kneels down to help him and he's still trying to hurt himself and hurt others, but she actually takes stuff out of his hands. So we've got that detail in there that Kari talked about. And this lets you see kind of immediately, again, not in some abstract, research shows that having a point of contact immediately helps students, blah, blah, blah. It gives us that real, here's what's actually happening, and here's what our organization is doing. Now, again, we would continue after that last paragraph, we would continue about how they had reassessed the schedule, how they had worked, how things had worked for him, how he had improved, how Grant moved through the organization, how that is different or the same as others, but kind of showing that flow. So we would have gone into a little more. But then that takes us to the result. So we know that Grant has learned to catch himself when he starts to lose his temper, and he's better at keeping his cool. He's still working at moderating his behavior, but he's more focused in class, and in turn, his classmates are better able to learn. So that shows too that everything isn't solved. They're still working. Grant is still having some issues, but still working with the organization, and things are improving overall. And then we get into the more typical that people expect. This story is one of just hundreds that play out each year in our community schools. And from there in the grant, we then talked about, the organization works in 33 schools, and here are the stats, and here are the number of grants that we help out every year. All of that, talking about obviously the full breadth of what the organization does. But just across this story, I'm gonna indulge myself and flip back for a second. We've talked about the need. We talked about not a boring statistic of there are X children who are facing behavioral troubles in schools. We're talking about our friend Grant, our little 5-year-old who's having problems and needs help, and we're here to help him. Then we take that into that broader discussion. We're talking about what the organization does, again, not using best practices and citing the research and all of that, although we do that later. We're talking about it with how Grant is assisted, how the organization helps Grant, this one kid who needs help. And then we roll into, and here's what happens because of all that. And again, follow this up with more statistics and more information and more best practices and more citations. But again, this is still focused on Grant's story. So I hope that everybody can see in the examples that we've given here, ways that, I said this isn't just nice. This is critical. So I hope you're all seeing ways that your organization can do this and talk more about storytelling in what you do. So just to wrap up, and Kari, feel free to jump in at any point if you've got more to add. But why telling a story matters? Because data is not going to move anybody to action. There's some great quote that I'm probably going to butcher That's basically data arouses the mind, stories arouse action. They are what makes people do things. So what makes a good story that funders will respond to is something that is going to be easily understood, that is universal, that maybe has a surprise twist, and that funders can see is real and that is credible. So collecting stories, obviously we want to make sure that you've got some kind of mechanism for that and that it is part of what you do every day and not just some nice thing that gets added on when you need one once in a while. And then how to use stories in your grant. So that what we just talked about, either leading with that gut punch of a story that helps people understand what's going on, or keeping a story woven throughout what you're doing. And Kari, I don't know if you want to jump in on any of that.
No, I was just going to invite, again, if people have questions or comments. I know that sometimes when we talk about storytelling, we do get people bringing up the unfortunate reality of character count limits, word count limits, and online applications. So, unfortunately, we don't have a magic wand or magic answer for that, other than to say, there's usually always a way to weave these in, even if you have to be brief, just bringing in even sometimes just a brief first person quote or a brief snippet here and there where you can, when you're really limited in space. Even that can be helpful. Another way we have found to be able to kind of bring those stories in to those online character count limited applications is when you have the opportunity to upload attachments, and particularly optional attachments. So we have worked with clients to create, like a 1 or 2 page PDF attachment, kind of testimonials, pictures, client stories. So, they're all in one page on a handout, and sometimes you're able to include that as an attachment. But, this is kind of the ideal. And then sometimes there's the reality of what grant applications will allow. But we would just say there's usually a way to fit them in, even if you don't have as much space as you would like.
Yeah, and I agree, Kari. I'm thinking right now, I was sort of laughing when we were talking about that, because I'm working on a particularly horribly constrained proposal as far as character limits go, that luckily does have that room for an attachment. And we are doing exactly what you said. We've got 2 compelling stories in there and are including some pictures. And we didn't talk about this because that's its whole other topic, but being able to show a couple pictures of what your work does, can be huge. And the client that I'm working with we have to discuss their lower level classrooms because it's in the lower level of their building. And if you just look at the bare facts, it seems kind of dungeon-like, but we're able to include a picture that shows how they're brightly lit and nice and, have a ton of decoration and are nicely painted and have great furniture and all that. So that too, I mean, if you've got compelling pictures that you can include with your stories, those are always great. Our caveat is also always on that, make sure that they are of your actual work and not stock photos. A stock photo, like a made up story, is not going to convince anybody. Make sure it's actually you, and make sure it's pretty obvious that it's actually your organization. Because that is, it would be really weird to just have a stock photo of here's some people looking at an exhibit instead of your actual art gallery. So
Go ahead.
I was
going to say the one other thing I'd add, and then I know we're going to wrap up for today, is that, Matt talked about it at the beginning. We're talking about storytelling through the lens of grant writing specifically today, but it really is throughout all of your organization's materials, whether it's an annual appeal letter or your annual report, all those things. So that can also be a way to kind of be able to sneak those into a grant proposal. If, again, for your attachments, you need to include an annual report, or you have the opportunity to include a newsletter or something like that. And if those materials have client stories woven in, then they will certainly supplement your grant proposal. But yes, the idea is that this is beyond, this concept can go beyond grant proposals into all of your agency materials, really.
For sure. Absolutely. Good. All right. Well, we unfortunately are just hitting the end of our time here. Just an email afterwards. with an email with the recording and a link to the site to sign up for the next 2 webinars and to sign up for coaching sessions. I very much encourage you. Again, the 1 in 2 weeks is focused on federal grants, but really is taking a team approach to large grants. And then December 14th is how local organizations can attract national funders. So I think with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Dana for our official closeout, I believe.
All right, guys, thank you so much. It was very interesting. I love that not only is it not, a nice aspect for the reader who's getting the grants, but for those writing it, I could feel like it would probably be easier than writing what you normally do for grant proposals. So thank you so much. Like I said, emails will be going out with the recordings, and thank you everyone for joining us.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone.